So I'm going to do a small video on motion blur. Now there's a very interesting question that was brought to my attention by some awesome friends. This is by Harvey Rothman. I do have a motion blur CG question though. Are the keyframes limited to the frame rate that you're working in? If you wanted to really control the motion blur, you'd have to do some micro keying. Made that up. I actually do like that term. To control the shape of the blur, continued, a staggered shift on ones would just look like one held blurred image. So how would you control the motion blur's bias towards one frame or another? Now, I'm familiar with Blender, so I'm not too sure if this applies to other applications. Now with 3D, we're at the whims of a camera, a physical camera with settings. For example, here I'm using just the Render Engine Eevee, and there is a handy feature just called Motion Blur, which you can toggle. And with it, you can change the speed of the shutter, which then controls the amount of motion blur applied to the image itself. If you have the shutter speed at 0, which would be super fast, barely any lag or delay, there will be no motion blur. So for an example, I've created this image, this animation of a very fast cubic head turn here. There is a quick whip up and pan down here, and it's fairly evenly spaced out. Motion blur is subject to the object's velocity, so if you want something stylized, you'll have to really ramp up and stylize the speeds of the head turns, which then you can comp out later, or like create a new matte and do selective blurring. So just for a quick example here, motion blur standard settings is, I think it's 0.5. If I hit render image, you can see there's a slightly bit of motion blur. If I put this at 0 and render this out again, you can see no motion blur because the shutter speed is there's barely any, it's like super fast. If we go up to 1 and we render this image out, you can see we're starting to get more of a blur here, and you can see the slight shape trying to turn and interpolate between the two. We can go past the hard limits. If I go, let's say, something crazy like 500, you can see we're getting really, really crazy motion blurs. And now what's happening too is the position of where the focus is on the center of frame. If we do something, let's see, on the start of the frame, render, and let's just render this out, just hit F12 here. You can see like it's slightly changing where the focus is. And if we do the end of the frame here, render image, you can see that's where the main focus is. It just depends on the kind of look. Standards usually around center on frame. You'll probably have to experiment with this more, just to see what kind of blurs you want. And now for the fun part here. So this is fairly suddenly going up and spinning around, but if I want to exaggerate this kind of movement, I have to really whip this the speeds up this way, which we could use as one frame here, or we can use one rendering pass as the whole motion blur aspect of it. So if I just turn this character's head like this, so when he whips, it's super fast. Like it's a huge arc. So if we render this out, keeping it at 1, you can see it's starting to really blur. Now if we add more exaggeration, let's say if we start trailing this object, so rather than it just being a single cube, what I mean by that is if the turn is also accentuated by the shape of this morphing towards it, it'll definitely exaggerate it even more. So let's just say, as a quick example, can I actually scale the frames? Would that work? Let's just take a look here. I might have to do a shape blend key here. No, that doesn't work that way. Okay, we could, I'll just show you as a quick example this way. So let's say if I do, when he's this character's turning, we can just do, probably just, how would I do this? We could probably, do it like this, and then when it hits here, just return it back to 1. And now if we go here, render image, we're getting more of a smear that way. And just to like lower that a bit, let's go back here. So it looks hilarious. You can see there's more of that smear that way, and it goes up this way. So if I do a very quick render, let's do a quick fast render. I'm just gonna pause the recording here. Okay, I'm back here and rendered it all out. And just to show you frame by frame here, you can see more of that stretched exaggeration. Now, if you had a better rig and actually follow the path of the motion, I definitely think you could control it that way. So, yeah, you have to take into account the shutter speed. If you want more drastic effects, it'd be slower shutter speed or a higher count, larger number in terms of Blender. And if there are smears that I wanted to be added onto the motion blur, you'd have to manipulate the mesh itself to accentuate that, as well as the velocity of the actual object moving to create more of the faster smears. So I like the term microkeying, because then you can go in. Oh, nice. You can go in and say, let me just delete this here, and let's go back into this keyframe. Whoops. And let's delete these ones here. I think we could definitely accentuate various aspects of things here. So if we wanted, we just, I'm in local, global. Fast that turns this way. And let's just rotate it down like this again. Just like swoop. With this, you can see it's starting to get really fast this way here. I also talked about using compositing. So we could have one layer or view layer in Blender here having all the motion blur aspects. So if we really accentuate it a lot, like say like this, and if you have a very specific blur in mind where it's like, oh, I actually want these edges here to be super sharp, and maybe this character had features here that I would like to be in view for easier readability, you would then create a separate compositing with mats on it with no motion blur. So for example here, I just created a new scene where the character head is red. So you'd render these out. This should also be all black, so it would just be this one red mat here. You'd render this out, then you'd composite the two layers on top, and you can use the red value here as a mask on top of the motion blur and maybe add some gradients, so that way you're really controlling the focus and having selective blurs in certain areas. Of course, you can also use the motion blur and compositing software to really blur the edges out. There are a lot of techniques, but oh yeah, hopefully this answers that question, maybe. Thank you.